Hello all, welcome to RAAONLINE. I'm Dr. Shivapriya and we had seen about the anatomy of larynx in our previous class. I had explained in detail about all the muscles, cartilages of larynx, and we saw what are all the structures importantly in the larynx. In this section of the larynx, we're going to see about the physiology of larynx. So what is the function of this larynx? In general, we know that larynx is called the voice box. So many of us think it's only for the voice. So larynx's function is only voice. That is what most of us think because it's called the voice box or the vocal box. So it has many other functions in relation to voice, and let's see what are all the functions that this small larynx does. And I hope we know about the measurements of larynx from the previous class. That's why I call it small. What all functions these laryngeal structures are doing in our body we'll be able to see in this section. So we have respiration and swallowing happening at the same part of our larynx. There is larynx and laryngopharynx behind. You have to eat, breathe all in the same region but through different pathways. So can we eat and breathe at the same time? Does it happen? We have to think about it. No, you can never breathe when you swallow. Why? Because when you breathe, the laryngeal inlet is open. But when you swallow, the esophagus is open. Both cannot happen at the same time. So how all these are regulated is what we're going to see. We have to see to that the airway protects the food from entering into the trachea. It should not enter into the trachea. So it does its function of preventing the food from entering into the trachea and passing it into the food passage. So ideally it should go to the food passage and not into the laryngeal inlet. That is what we're trying to achieve from this physiology. So in general, what are all the functions of the larynx? First it is the respiratory air channel. We know we breathe through the nostrils. It goes into the nasopharynx, goes into the oropharynx, then reaches the larynx, and from the larynx it goes into the trachea. So it is the respiratory air channel. So only when the larynx is intact we are able to breathe. So what are all these functions of the larynx? It is attached to the structures and it gives protection to the lower airway. So we know we have the lung, we have the windpipe, bronchus. So food should not enter into that one. Secondarily, air, it is a passage for, so it is a protection for air. How it protects, we're going to see. What are all the structures that protect the larynx, we're going to see. So in case what happens, if suppose something enters off into the larynx. So imagine when you swallow, sometimes if the food enters into the larynx, what do? We cough. We cough out that whatever particle that is entering into the windpipe or trachea or the bronchus. So that reflux is also a part of the function of larynx. And as we all know, phonation and speech. In fact, to be very frank, phonation and speech may be the last of the functions of the larynx, because first thing is respiration. It helps in breathing. So the role of the larynx in respiration is that it is a tubular structure first of all, and it is the narrowest part of the airway. Now if we see, the bronchus has a lumen, the trachea has a lumen, it has a considerable amount of lumen, whereas the trachea, above the trachea is the vocal cords. This vocal cords, in between the two vocal cords, it is a very narrow space. So only when these vocal cords move, air will enter into the lower airway, into the trachea or the bronchus. So through this narrow space only air has to enter, and this determines the resistance to the airflow, because if imagine there is one vocal cord not moving, then there will be resistance to the airflow. So that small glottis regulates the air that is entering into the lower airway. And in the previous class, we would have discussed about what are the muscles that are moving the larynx. So it is this posterior cricoarytenoid muscle that opens the larynx. That is called the abduction of the vocal cords. That means it opens the larynx. So that happens during inspiration. So every response that is given to the larynx, it opens and closes the glottis, and that is how we are able to breathe. Now, there is a mechanism called the three-tier mechanism, or it is called the sphincteric function of the larynx. What is this function? As we have discussed, when we swallow food should not enter into the trachea or the bronchus. It should enter into the laryngopharynx, into the piriform, into the esophagus. Now, how does this happen? there are these three structures, that is the aryepiglottic folds, the ventricular folds and the vocal folds, which will move together to close the laryngeal inlet. In other words, the opening into the larynx or the laryngeal inlet is formed by these three structures. They are the aryepiglottic fold, the ventricular folds and the vocal folds. Okay, so these three will close at a time when you swallow. So the larynx is closed and the food pipe is open and food will enter into the esophagus. How these structures will open, we'll see. Now this marked portion is only called the aryepiglottic fold. It is just present between the epiglottis and the arytenoid. So these aryepiglottic folds form the superior inlet of the larynx, and this only separates the pharynx from the vestibule of the larynx. We mean by meaning the inlet of the larynx, that's all. So it is present just between the epiglottis and the arytenoids, and there are some muscles that are attached to this also. Sometimes it is believed that this closure is being stabilized by the cuneiform cartilage. Last class we have already read about the false vocal cords, which are formed from the quadrangular membrane. So this is the false vocal cords that is mentioned here. So the aryepiglottic fold along with the false vocal cords along with the true vocal cords only form this three-tier mechanism. So this false vocal cord is present between the vestibule and the ventricle. So it is attached to the true vocal cords or the ventricular folds. It is flat and it contains a lot of mucous glands and it is a fibroelastic tissue. So first the posterior part of the false vocal cord will abduct, and then there is like the inward rotation. So first the posterior part, then the middle part, then the anterior part. That's how the movement of the false vocal cord will be. So closure is completed by the forward tilt of the arytenoids, which plugs the final small gap at the posterior end. So now what we are pointing here is the true vocal cord. So this white cord-like structure is called the true vocal cord. So these we know it is present between the arytenoids and the thyroid lamina. So from the vocal process of the arytenoids it will be attached to, and movement of this vocal folds only helps opening the inlet of the larynx. Now as we see in this picture, this is the place where the laryngeal inlet is open. So if you see here, this is the tracheal ring. So air will enter only through this small gap which is called the glottis. So this is the true vocal cord, this is the false vocal cord, and what we see here is the arytenoid, and this is the AE fold. Now what happens when we swallow? All this will close and then the laryngeal inlet is completely closed. So food, it makes sure that the food is not entering into the larynx, whereas it enters into this is the pyriform fossa. So it enters into the pyriform fossa and goes into the esophagus. So this is how the mechanism of swallowing happens, such that the food does not enter into the trachea and it enters here. So one more thing that we have to know is, when all these things are closing, what happens? We have seen in the last class that there are also muscles attached to the external part of the larynx. So these muscles will help elevate the larynx. Okay, so that in that class itself we would have dealt about muscles that are elevators and depressors. So once it elevates the larynx, what happens? There will be some negative pressure created here, and that will directly push the bolus into the, by bolus I mean the food that is chewed. So that enters into the